Greetings all. Welcome back to the Coptimizer podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Flanley, and today's guest is Mike Malpass. Mike is a retired police officer from Phoenix, Arizona. And as I talked about just a minute ago on our intro, he's the author of a few books that we're going to dive into today. Taming the Serpent, Fall 7, Rise 8, and just hearing the titles of those books, you know, they're very motivating. So great job on those. But Mike, welcome to the show. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the chance to talk about the brain and training. I can do it all day.
Well, we'll try not to go all day, but I have a tendency to run long.
Me too.
Before we get rolling, maybe just talk a little bit about yourself. You have a background as an MMA fighter before you got into policing, and I think that's going to be important in a couple of the things that we're going to talk about today. But if you don't mind.
Yeah, I got into the martial arts, I think, like most kids did. Well, in my generation anyway. It started with boxing. I saw the Rocky movie, and then that started it. But I've been training in martial arts since I was 10 or 11 years old. Started doing amateur boxing, did some amateur kickboxing, and then my prime was pretty much over by the time MMA came, but I decided to do it anyway. So in the early days of NHB, I had a couple of those fights when there weren't a lot of rules, and then kept fighting. Had a few more fights in MMA, nothing crazy. I think I had a total of 7 MMA fights, and then realized that I'm getting a little bit too old for this, that I had already become a cop. I had continued fighting when I was a police officer. But the whole reason I ever got involved in the first place was fear management, that idea of not wanting to be ruled by fears. I knew I wanted to be a cop as many times as someone tried to convince me not to be a police officer. Growing up, I always wanted to be at first it was the U.S. Marshal. I saw Rooster Cogburn and I wanted to be a U.S. Marshal.
Classic.
And I found out they didn't have horses anymore. And I was like, well, darn, now what? And so the police officer was the next thing. And then, but the whole goal was, if I'm going to do it, I want to do it right. And I had a lot of people who, like coaches and stuff, who were Vietnam veterans. A lot of them were police officers. So I had a lot of great guides along the way. And one of the biggest encompassing message I took from all of them was this: preparation is key, and that the mental preparation is as key as the physical performance parameters. And I think that pretty much that launched everything, and that started the idea of studying how this all worked. But it was really in the last 5 years where science just took off, and they've learned so much more. A lot of it that validates the things done before, and a lot of things that says, yeah, you probably shouldn't do that anymore.
Well, trial and error learning, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's pretty much the way that we've done it for a long time. And sadly, I think we're often a little bit slow to adopt to modern training methodologies. There's a lot of police officers, right? 800,000, approximate police officers in the United States, 18,000 agencies, with all the way from major metropolitan police departments all the way down to your 2, 3, 4-man departments. So there's a big difference, and that's kind of one of the themes that we keep touching on is in this day and age of defund the police, reimagine the police. What does that really mean? And for you and your experience from a training perspective, I think you have so much to bring to the future of policing. I just got your books. Dug into Taming the Serpent. I can't wait to get into the second one already. Just the Kaizen philosophy and Fall 7, Rise 8. I'm really interested in getting into that. But I wanted to touch real quick you have a story early in your book where you were talking about some of these veterans that you worked with and their influence on you and how it impacted community policing, and this idea of modern community policing, really, I think oftentimes we try to reinvent the wheel. So I think it's fascinating to know that, hey, there was a lot that we've learned from that generation, from the 60s and 70s, right? Policing was really going through a big struggle, and now we're in the early 2020s, and we're having the same issues.
Yeah, and what we learned, if I write a third book, it will be about the beat cop. That's what the third book, if I ever do one, it's going to be about that, because that next generation, those Vietnam veterans that came back and became police officers, they brought it was kind of this idea of, if you know everybody in the community and everybody in the community knows you, then you have a partnership. If you feel like you're at war with your community, then what'd you leave Vietnam for? And I had some of them say that to me. They're like, man, you should know every single person in your beat. And what ended up happening with law enforcement is they decided we're going to do more and more and more and more, which left less time for you to get out of your car, talk to people, help people out, just talk to them on a daily basis. I couldn't even tell you the number of crimes my partner and I solved because my partner already had a tremendous relationship with his beat. I then moved into that beat, and he introduced me to everybody. And when you know everyone and everyone, it was amazing when someone would accuse us of something and someone from the community would come forward and go, no, 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 Mike and Mike don't do that, man. Mike and Mike are always helping us out. Mike and Mike are always making sure everybody is taken care of. That beat cop mentality is what, you call it what you want. Everybody comes back with a new word for it. Community-based policing, all of it is good beat cops. But if the only thing you're doing is responding to radio call after radio call and you don't care which cop takes it, when do they have any assigned beat really other than a radio tag signal? And when do they ever get out of their car and talk to people? If you're only going from hot call to hot call, violence to violence, these officers' own body budgets are going to be pulled. Their stress level is going to go through the roof. The biggest thing about beat cops, you know what you're fighting for. You're fighting for every single person in that beat. And you find out that the majority of the people that you work with in your beat are wonderful people who are just trying to make a living, man. They're just trying to do just what we are. But you don't get to see that when you're only going hot call to hot call because you're 60% understaffed. And that's the biggest thing that's happening right now. We're so understaffed that it's all about radio calls and it's not about personal interaction anymore.
Yeah, it's a really it's a fascinating juxtaposition. On one hand, you have this demand for quality community policing, trust and transparency. On the other hand, you have this press and this use for technology, and so it does create that drive through the neighborhood to a call rather than and the way I've said it, talked about this in the past, is you become a part from the community rather than a part of the community in which you're policing. And technology, it can play a big as great as it can be, it can also drive some of these issues because you're looking at a screen, your phone, your laptop, your radio, your dash cam, your body cam. You've got all this technology surrounding you, and sometimes that makes it hard just to roll down your windows and just listen and wave and say hello and stop and chat when you're, again, like you said, when you're pressed and you're running from call to call.
And how amazing was it? Like just one example, my partner and I are on our weekend. So we're not even reporting to work. My partner gets a phone call from someone in the beat. Hey, did you hear about that little girl who got raped? And we hadn't been at work. And he was like, no. And he goes, well, hey, you didn't get this from me, but I know who did it. And now we get the ball rolling. And what do? We call into our boss, and our boss is like, well, hey, get to work, boys, go to it. Within 3 days, we had him in custody. We had the confession. We closed a case within 3 days that would have taken months to pursue, all because the community believed in us enough to give us a call and say, hey, we'll work with you, but we're not working with anybody else. That's the kind of stuff, man. 11 years of SWAT. It's awesome. I loved the SWAT team. I loved everything I did there. But my favorite time as a cop was 9 years working a beat with the best cop I've ever worked with, Mike Yatsko. It was an amazing experience to be a beat cop, and I still think it's my favorite part of the job.
Yeah, so I think the future really is about it's really about the balance.
Yeah.
How do you balance the the needs of the community, the needs to create relationships so people will share information, the needs to protect the time of an officer. So, the technical term for it, right? You have allocate, you're in from a patrol allocation study perspective, you have obligated time versus unobligated time. So, what's the ultimate balance, and how much free time should an officer have to be able to do free patrol where they're driving around and building that? But the dangers, and this is where we can just kind of dive right in now into the part where you've been really pioneering and bringing some of this great research to the law enforcement profession. We talked a little bit on our pre-call the other day about some of the different readings and stuff that you've done, and this is the body keeps the score with Bessel van der Kolk, and we talked a little bit about him and his research. But I wanted to read just a quick paragraph from his book, and I think it'll set the table for us. Research from the new discipline has revealed that trauma produces actual physiological changes, including a recalibration of the brain's alarm system, an increase in stress hormone activity, and alterations in the system that filters relevant information from irrelevant. We now know that trauma comprises the brain area that communicates the physical, embodied feeling of being alive. These changes explain why traumatized individuals become hypervigilant to threat at the expense of spontaneously engaging in their day-to-day lives. They also help us understand why traumatized people so often keep repeating the same problems and have such trouble learning from experience. We now know that behaviors are not the result of moral failings or signs of a lack of willpower or bad character. They are caused by actual changes in the brain.
Yes.
From a police officer's perspective, that pretty much sums up, I think, the problem that we're having in American policing today: overtaxing, under-resourcing, not training sufficiently, and we're setting officers up for failure rather than success. What say you?
That's exactly right. And the term, if you wanted to look more into it, is affective, AFF, affective neuroscience. And it's how the brain makes predictions about your reality. Everything to your brain is a prediction. And in fact, your brain plays this cool trick on you. We believe that everything that is happening in real time. But under the best of circumstances, what's happening, by the time you interpret it and are running it through cognitively, you're conscious of what's happening. You're at least 4/10 of a second in the past. So we live at least 4/10 of a second in the past. And what the brain is doing with that information is taking all of your past behavior, comparing it to what's happening now. And then it does this amazing thing. It not only says, where is it? How do we interact with it? And what are we going to do about it? It says, in the past, it cost us this much energy to deal with it. And then the brain starts to ramp up those areas of the motor cortex as if the prediction it makes about what to do is true. Now you get this sense of embodiment, as if the prediction is true. You believe it's true because it's already starting. The neurons are already starting to excite. Now you have an opportunity to override this at that 4/10 of a second mark but most people don't. In your daily life, think of all the things you do by pure habit alone without really thinking about it. And that's this system driving that. When you have that measure, that memory of a energy expenditure, and the system starts to excite, you will start to feel movement on valence and arousal. Valence, it's either good for you, bad for you. Arousal, it's either high or low, or both of them are in the middle. At the very extremes of valence and arousal are where your emotions are. So emotion is really a memory of past energy expenditure. And when you talk about things like fear, Fear doesn't happen because of something. Fear is predicted because this is how you felt in the past. So if you understand that now and you want to change what happens tomorrow, then you need to change the present today. You can't worry so much about the past, but you have a lot to overcome. That is all of the history that came behind it. So guys, neuroscientists like Robert Sapolsky believe there really isn't much free will. Lisa Feldman Barrett, who wrote a book called How Emotions Are Made, she is one of the real pioneers of affective neuroscience, believes there is room there. And it's done by changing tomorrow's predictions by changing today. And it's really amazing science. And I think that science is kind of where we need to go going forward. And when we talk about fear, anxiety, stress, and pressure for law enforcement, that is the key to changing tomorrow's behaviors. And again, not that we're doing it horribly wrong. The percentage of officers who do it wrong are really small. You just hear about it so much in the news. Your brain has a bias that it grabs that information. And when it stays in the 24-hour news cycle, your brain starts to believe it's happening all the time. It's just a bias we carry in our brain. We carry at least over 150 cognitive biases. What I like about affective neuroscience is it simplifies it. It's just a prediction error. Your brain made a prediction error, and now you either learn from it or you bypass it.
So so we'll have to go backwards a little bit to talk about why this is important. So maybe can you give us a little bit of background about your experience? So you're at age 10, 11, 12, you understand that, hey, I don't want to be controlled by fear. I want to have confidence in my abilities to be able to defend myself and protect myself and do things that need to be done. And that you eventually move into whether it's the octagon, but then out onto the street where you become a police officer. So, maybe quickly just tell us, how your career progressed, but then let's go back and kind of talk about how your understanding of this brain science has evolved and changed your perspective on training for police officers today.
Okay. Yeah. So when I first started competitively fighting, boxing, kickboxing, and then I kind of had it down by the time I started doing the MMA. But if you ever competed any sport whatsoever, and you've got the day of the event, and there's the time before the event to the time the event starts, and you got the butterflies in your stomach, you've got the jitters, and you're pacing up and down, and you're wasting a tremendous amount of energy, and nobody ever tells you that. Those were the feelings where I'm like, well, am I afraid? I don't really feel afraid. I feel like I'm prepared for this, but why is all this happening? And nobody can really tell you that until you talk to some of the old time fighters. The old time fighters had some great sayings. A lot of guys used to quote Customado, Mike Tyson's trainer, and it was that fear is a fire. You can use it as energy or it can consume you. Don't let it consume you. Well, that's great advice and it's true, but then how? And you look at all the great fighters who walk to an arena and they're not fighting for 3 hours. They put headphones on and they take a nap. And you see the other guy pacing the room like a tiger. And he's just going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And he's using a tremendous amount of energy. And by the time the fight breaks, the champion looks like he just woke up from a nap. And the challenger looks like he just already fought 10 rounds and is about to take on the champ. So it was trying to get a handle on that. And then the greatest revelation I had was one day I told a coach I was looking for a perfect fight. That was it. I couldn't stop competing until I found the perfect fight. And he laughed and he was like, what the hell is that? There is no perfect fight. He goes, a perfect fight would be one you choreograph and you give the guy a script and you say, hey, just do me a favor and do this for me, would you? He goes, that's perfect. He goes, but that's never going to happen. What we're learning to do is be the eye of the storm in a chaotic environment. He goes, that's all you're looking to do. When it goes wrong, and it's going to go wrong, you want to develop enough training that you're like, okay, this may not be an exact circumstance I've faced before, but man, I've dealt with chaos before. So instead of freaking out, I'm going to calm myself down and I'm going to find my way out of this. So by the time I was a cop in Ohio first, Dublin, Ohio, it's a very affluent town, wonderful people. But the first person I had a drunk driver who was happened to be an attorney and on my guess would be at the time a tremendous amount of steroids. And he's extremely intoxicated and he's pretty full of himself. And I remember he's getting all huffed up and he's starting to adjust his head and he's starting to squeeze his fists. And I remember laughing. And he looked at me and why are you laughing? And I go, because, well, number one, I'm really good at this. And number two, if you were going to hit me, why would you telegraph it by doing all the crazy stuff you're doing right now? And if I were you, man, I'd just take the lump. You're going to get a DUI, big deal. Why would you want to risk what's coming your way if you take a swing at me? I go, I'm pretty good at this, but if you want to take a swing, have at it, man. And as it happened, my sergeant was pulling up at that time. And we get the guy in custody and stuff. And, he resisted a little bit, but it was no big deal. So my sergeant was like, well, are you going to charge him with resisting arrest? And I'm like, nah, that wasn't really resisting. That's just a drunk being a fool. No big deal. And he goes, well, and my sergeant was actually being smart. He was a kind of a didactic learner. He would ask all these probing questions and we'd just go back and forth. And he goes, well, you seem pretty calm for a rookie who was just about to get into his first fight. And I was like, that wasn't going to be a fight. You want to see what a fight looks like? Holy cow, I'll show you that. Because this face used to look like Brad Pitt. It don't look like Brad Pitt no more. So then he was like, well, this is interesting. So now I'm really young, but he's like, hey, would you talk to some of the guys about it? Would you start teaching defensive tactics a little bit? But I'm at the time I was competing in kickboxing a lot and then taking boxing fights just to help pay the rent. So what do? You come in and you start teaching kickboxing and you're like, well, I don't know if kicks are really going to, get it done unless you keep them real low line. So you start making adjustments. But the biggest thing I noticed from going 5 years in Ohio and then going to Phoenix was the athletes, the soldiers, the prior cops were way better at managing the conflict than people who were brand new to it. And that became this quest to find out, well, how do we bridge that gap? Because it's probably safe to say we're not only going to hire Division I athletes, we're not only going to hire wrestlers, fighters. And unfortunately, a lot of agencies won't hire people from the military, which it blows my mind. So how do we bridge that gap? And that became this career-long quest to do that. And the missing piece for me has always been that neuroscience. I was really worried about all the dings I've taken to my head. So I was starting to look into it. And then all of a sudden I started finding more and more research. And then better yet, some of those same people started writing books. And the books were not written for other neuroscientists. They were written for folks like me who had taken some dings to the head. And then as I read more and more and started learning more and more, I started getting a better vocabulary for how to bridge that gap. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that I learned. There is a way to do it. And instead of just learning by taking hard knocks until you're like a domestic violence survivor, where it's just like, been there, done that. What more can you do to me that hasn't already been done? There's more intelligence behind it. So there was not a lot for me. For me, it was taking repeated beatings, learning from it, moving forward, and slowly over time getting better at handling those emotions. I would not suggest that path to a young officer. So the question was, can we find ways of doing it without it being that excessive? And I think we're getting there. We're doing a really good job of getting there now. But now it's turning hearts and minds to that idea because it requires a complete paradigm shift from everything we've done before.
And I think a lot of people are familiar with the work of Kevin Gilmartin. If you said that name in law enforcement, almost everybody is going to know that name. And I was very fortunate to be able to go and present to the National FOP Wellness Conference with Dr. Gilmartin. And one of the things, he's had a big shift too about this comprehensive approach to wellness and preparation. But when the term hypervigilance, which Van der Kolk talks about, Kevin Gilmartin really brought that into policing, and it's kind of like the mind versus the body, emotional versus the physical, mental versus the physiological, and those things we try to separate them, but the reality is that you can't. I mean,
Exactly.
it's just like, great fitness is directly connected to great nutrition. You're never going to be really physically fit if you're not eating well. And it's the same thing on the mental and emotional side. If you're not feeding yourself appropriately and doing the mentally recharging, then there's going to be a weakness there. And then all of those things, they interact, and that's kind of, I think, where this modern science has taken us. And again, that's why I think your work is going to be so impactful. And one thing, when just digging into your book, in the first chapter, we could probably talk for a day just on this chapter, but I kind of want to touch on a few things as we evolve in this conversation. But with what you just said there, in bringing this new way of thinking and this new way of training into law enforcement, you have to be able to convince not just administrators that it's the right thing to do, but more importantly, you have to be able to convince the officers that this is the right path, and this is the way that's going to lead you to success. So you really kind of laid out, and I don't want to put you on the spot here, but you laid out 5 things just in the first chapter that I think just set, if anyone is considering getting into training, or they're thinking about reviewing the training processes, are you doing the right things? If you read these 5 things right here, I think you're on the right path. And, that's what, starting with the understanding of the brain and stress, and how it helps you, how to learn, how to, use the term biohack, how to, to achieve peak performance, because in law enforcement, that's really the ultimate, right? That's what we have to be able to do, is train officers to be able to perform under stress. And what we see on the television and what we see get, plastered on the evening news and in newspapers for cycle after cycle is the examples of where we didn't do it well.
Right.
So, and then you also, the second part was understanding your own brain and conflict, and then how you manage that, understanding the brain and what happens in that balance between the emotional and the cognitive control, understanding the brain and conflict, how it aids in comprehending how problems can occur, and then really the memory system. So I don't know if I just stole all your thunder there, but I don't know if you want to touch on that real
No,
briefly.
that's a good tee up right there. So the piece that is missing is that law enforcement is not lacking good instructors. We have great instructors. And now, my God, there's so many retired people who are now opening training businesses. They're teaching skills, and it's incredible. They're all wonderful at what they do. But the piece that's missing is, it's all the brain, man. Everything we do, thought, perception, action, dreaming, hallucinating, it's all the brain. And we don't get this user's manual with this brain. So from book 1 to book 2, I kind of changed my idea of biohacking. Biohacking is like, it implies that we're maybe cheating, that we're doing something we shouldn't be doing. And really all we're doing is understanding how the central nervous system really works, applying that information so it works to our benefit, and understanding when it's working against someone else. So you can tell when someone is cognitively stuck in a limbic loop, when they're really stuck on prediction, but no answer to that prediction. And if you ask them a question and they can't answer that question, if they're lost, then their cognitive function is right now offline. They are still they're stuck in prediction. They're stuck in the emotion of the event. And this is what happens when you bring a lot of drugs into play. You're now exciting a system that is your reward system, but there really isn't anything happening outside that connects with the reward. And now you're ramping up fight or flight systems in the body, and everything is changing inside of the body right now. And you want to talk about misprediction. You've now, by taking fentanyl, by taking your opioids, you have created misprediction in your brain. And because the brain can't predict well, whenever anything happens, especially like a confrontation with the police, fight or flight starts to ramp up. And those energy systems are now going to put out a massive prediction of a massive amount of energy. And when you're already reacting to the drugs that are on board, the system inside is it's going to heat up. And what you see a lot of times is someone getting way overheated, way over emotional, and that person is not going to make good predictions. So one of the things when you understand that is when it is feasible, if we can give them a little bit of space contained and we can give them some time, we can see if we can run some of that energy out of them. If there isn't space and time and it's an emergency, the exigency is there, then you got to go in and you got to do what you got to do. But you have to understand things like, look what it's doing to his brain and his physiology. What it's doing to his brain, we are social creatures. So our brains work off of each other. We predict off of each other. In fact, we conceptualize off each other. If you're not trained, then while his system is spinning up, your system is going to spin up. Now our predictions are going to be affected, and we're not making very good predictions back at them. Affective realism is that your brain makes a prediction quickly, very fast, but not very accurate. Your subconscious system is an implicit bias system. It is an implicit bias system. Implicit bias isn't something you catch. Implicit bias is the subconscious brain. Implicit, subconscious bias, hunches about risk and reward. That's what the subconscious brain does. The basal ganglia are this amazing structure in the middle of your brain, and their job is, where is it? How do I interact with it? What is it? What am I going to do about it? How much energy is it going to take? Boom, here's your reality. Affective realism is when the decision, there's not enough time, the decision is made that it is a gun, and then afterwards it turns out not to be a gun. But the amazing thing about affective realism is if your brain predicts gun, your brain can show you one. So afterwards, the officer, I swear, I saw a gun. And people are like, oh, he's lying. Not necessarily. How do you mistake a taser for a gun? Affective realism. How do you mistake a wallet for a gun? Affective realism. It's easy to throw out a term like racism and go, that's what it is. But if you look at the science, affective realism, think about it right now. Everybody listening or watching, picture in your head a gun right now. Any gun you want, but picture the gun in your head. How can you do that? Because the same visual system that allows you to see is the same visual system that predicts for you. It's the same way that you dream. A dream isn't real, but the visual system is showing you things. Your brain can do that to you while you're awake. Affective realism, there isn't enough time, so your brain makes a quick prediction and you see what you believe, which is exactly how the brain is wired. The brain is not wired for you to see and then believe. It is wired for you to believe and then see. Affective realism is when that happens, and unfortunately, there's sometimes tragic results.
Yeah, and that's for anyone that's not in law enforcement. I think a primary part of our audience really is going to be law enforcement leaders, and so for us, there's a little bit of preaching to the choir here. But I think what you just said is really important for leaders and officers to understand this, so they can explain it to others. And the time to do that is not when you're trying to defend an officer in a controversial use of force case. It's really in your community policing activities, in your citizens police academies, to bring people in and talk about the science behind why officers do what they do. And a couple examples maybe that we can bring up that some of them were recently in the news, and we talked a little bit about this. And I try to be cautious when I'm talking about officer involved cases, but in this case, it's public. The officer was subsequently fired for what they did, but it was in Massachusetts, where an officer who was directing traffic, and he's directing traffic at an intersection. And we talk about what you were saying, and tell me where I'm right, tell me where I'm wrong here. But in these predictions that an officer is making as they're standing, because it's not a safe thing to do. Directing traffic can be very dangerous. And any officer that's done it more than once realizes that people are not paying attention. Everybody's got their own priorities. Everybody's got someplace to be. And then worse, they're listening to music. They can't hear. Even worse than that, they're on their phones. They're distracted. So this officer in this case, he's standing at an intersection. There's a car coming from one direction, which he wants to stop. He raises his arm. The car does not stop. And so instead of, blowing a whistle, getting out of the way, he actually moves himself in front of the car and then actually hits the car as it goes by, screams at the driver. Turns out that it's a young lady who's wasn't paying attention. And the officer then gets into this, he starts screaming at her, tells her to pull over. She does. He abandons his post directing traffic, just leaves the intersection and goes and continues this verbal assault on this. I don't mean to make fun of it because, it's, as a former chief, these are the kind of things that keep you up at night when you see stuff like this. But, there's a part of me where I have empathy for the officer because I understand the emotions that grabbed a hold of him. And then there's the other part of me is like, yeah, but, and anyone that's, out of a basic, out of a field training officer program, knows that this is not the path we need to go down. So is it that projecting, I see a car, it's not complying with what I want it to do. It breaks that norm. It knocks me out of my cycle. Maybe there's an explanation that you can make that's better than what I just said, but how does that happen to a cop?
You're right on the money right there. So it's prediction, it's expectation, it's where our attention is. So what we pay attention to is where our immediate working memory is at. A lot of people, and this is a mistake people make when a cop's wearing a camera, they think the cop sees what the camera sees. Well, the camera may be pointed in one direction, the cop may be looking in another direction. There's no sequence for the two until you get eye tracking goggles so you can see where the cop was looking. There's a difference. So we pay attention to, let's say the lady was on her way to work. I don't know where she was going, but there's a certain expectation she has. And that expectation isn't that there's a cop standing in the middle of the intersection. So when there is a cop standing in the middle of the intersection, there's a deviation from her expectations. Now the cop is in the intersection and he assumes everybody can see me. Everyone is going to do what I tell them to do. And those are his expectations. And she deviated from his expectations. So now immediately when the brain is surprised, so a volatile environment, uncertain, chaotic, ambiguous, even any surprise, even a pleasant surprise, you walk home, boom, you're startled. And all of a sudden it turns out to be a surprise party for you. That initial startle is a fear. It's holy cow, what is this? I don't understand what's happening. And then boom, you find out valence and arousal. It's good. If this is for me and good, and arousal is high. Unfortunately, in that initial fear moment, we sometimes get stuck on stupid. And it's not just cops, it's everyone. So what happens is in her mind, it's simple. I made a mistake. Oh my God, I am so sorry. I wasn't expecting to see a cop there. In his mind, deviation from expectations, but in his mind, because of a looming effect, because of this idea of something moving forward, even if it's at your side, it can startle the brain. So in his mind, he is in fight or flight. And in that moment, he had to take himself out of it. He ramped it up. And that's where I think training is vital. We can show you hundreds of different examples where this happens. And there is this time frame where, don't get me wrong, you get out of your car and a guy comes at you with a knife and is about to stab you. There is no time for anything other than get to work. But in this time, there was a chance to take that pause and say to yourself, hey, wait a minute. Number one, I'm not dying. Number two, nobody died here. Let me take a couple of deep breaths. But we don't train that necessarily. Instead, we focus on the more politicized stuff, or we tend to love to pay for programs that wrap up things in these wonderful titles. And then it says, as long as you go to this training, everything's going to be okay. It's convenient and it checks a box. But the easiest way to look at this for anyone who's not a cop, who's never had this happen to them before, have you ever been in an argument, just a verbal argument with someone you care about deeply? You love this person and said something so horrible to them that afterwards you went, what the hell was I thinking? And why am I spending the next 6 weeks on the couch? That is exactly what it is. The brain is stuck in fight or flight. The brain wants the conflict to not only to be over, but the brain wants you to win. So what do? You send that zinger, and then right afterwards you go, oh man, that's going to cost me. And in his case, I guaranteed as soon as he called it in, or as soon as the call was over, he probably sat in his car for a second. Where did that come from? But another question, we talked about this last week. Another question I like to ask in cases like that is, tell me about the last 4 calls that guy went to. Tell me about his personal life. Tell me what's been happening. Because a couple times you get to these, you find out the guy's going through a horrible divorce. You find out that the first call out of the chute was something done so horrible to a child, you just can't wrap your head around it. Then the next call he went to is a drunk who's so out of control and just mean and aggressive. And then a couple of calls where they're just wasting his time, but he's just revved up, and his body budget is pulling energy. So now when the body budget is pulling energy, but there's nothing happening outside, anxiety starts to build up. And when anxiety builds up, we don't breathe properly. And when we don't breathe properly, our carbon oxygen exchange gets off and anxiety ramps up some more. So if you tell me about the couple of calls before, what's going on in his personal life and what kind of training this officer had for learning how to deal with these things, it comes into this package where you normally go, holy cow, he didn't have enough time to recover from the first call. No one ever really asked him how his personal life was anyway. And the training we gave him for dealing with emotional conflict is really some bargain basement checkbox training.
And that takes us right back to the science discussed by Van der Kolk there, right? So it may not be this person, is of bad moral, character, or just a bad person. It's just that the circumstances are overwhelming them, and there could be a really good explanation as to why that happened. But the sad thing is in this environment that we're working in right now, and this quite frankly is kind of at the core of everything that we want to talk about, is that that officer subsequently got fired. He lost his job. Now there could be history, there could be other things that sure. led up to that. That could have been the straw that broke the camel's back. I don't know the backstory, but I know that those people exist inside of every police department. And they weren't hired like that. They weren't trained to act like that, but something along the way leads us there, right? So there can be things there can be, what's accepted in an organization, right? The old saying, like, you get what you tolerate. So if you allow little things like that to build over time, then yeah, it's not a matter if there's going to be a problem, it's going to be when and how bad is it going to be. But when you start shrinking, the number of people that you have available to respond to these continually building traumatic incidents, then that's just more and more and more pressure that we're putting on these individuals. And so then when we do send them into that environment, we're expecting flawless behavior. And then you brought up the idea of the camera as well. The camera in and of itself adds not only it adds a level of protection for the officer, but it also adds a level of pressure, because now that everything that I do is being recorded, and that creates that it's just, if you're thinking about gears, that's a couple more notches on the gear that's just a little bit longer for us to turn in these decision making processes. And in the end, a camera only sees what the camera sees. It doesn't see what the officer sees. It doesn't feel what the officer feels. It doesn't know the officer's experiences. And so it's easy to make quick judgments. Look at that, and this, I think, feeds into what you were talking about also. Look at that crappy officer. Look at, he doesn't care about people. And now the same things that we accuse the police of, we're guilty of ourselves, right? That confirmation bias.
Absolutely.
I'm looking for examples of poor policing. I found it, and guess what? Now I'm going to start looking for more because that's what I want to see.
And you'll find it.
Yep.
Like one of the cognitive psychologists use it. They say you don't notice a lot of red cars until you're looking for a red car, and then you'll see them everywhere. Why? Because you're expecting to see them. It's not a normal thing. But the key thing I think that people need to understand, and this one will make more sense to people who aren't cops, but this is the hard lesson that a lot of younger cops need to learn. The brain is designed for balance. We are not designed, this brain is not designed for us to be aesthetically happy. It's not designed for us to be aesthetically miserable. It's designed for us to find balance. Now, homeostasis used to be the word. In effective neuroscience, they use the word allostasis. It's this idea that you want to be able to predict the right amount of energy at the right time, and then to be able to recover back to baseline. Everything should take you back to baseline. But if you don't understand that, then you go from call to call to call to call. Then you go home and go, oh my God, that was so stressful. And now you have a couple of drinks, and now your sleep is affected because alcohol affects your sleep. You have a crappy night's sleep. The next day you should exercise, but you feel crappy, so you don't. And it starts this downward spiral where when you had a balance point that's right here, it now lowers. And you're now working from a broken body budget. The body budget acts like a finance department of a company. We have to have energy going out. We have to have energy coming in. And we have to have a balance in those things. If we don't have that balance, then what will end up happening is anxiety is concern about something that hasn't happened yet, and you're revving up the system. Once you run out of the energy for anxiety, now flip the coin and you've got depression. Depression is there's no more energy for being anxious. So the best prediction of the brain is just lay there and do nothing. And there is your depression where you're just, I feel miserable. And if you don't take these things into account, this homeostasis or allostasis into account, then you're constantly going to pull yourself out of whack. And sooner or later, you're going to be affected by it. And sooner or later, you're going to get sick if you let it carry on too long.
So that allostatic load eventually, it can bring any. It doesn't matter how. And again, if it doesn't even matter if you're the person that's eating right, exercising all the time. If you're out of balance and there's too much pressure and you're not unloading it, or managing it appropriately, eventually it's going to catch up with you.
That's it. And toward the end of my SWAT career, it caught up to me. I was healthy. I was working out all the time. I was eating right. I was sleeping as best I could, but we had a pretty high workload. So the sleep wasn't great, but when I could get it, I got it. But then next thing you know, the injury started. And then it started in the neck, arthritis in the neck. And then it started these recurring stingers. Then the shoulders started acting up. Then the knees started acting up. And then I ended up with plantar fasciitis in both feet. And of all of them, that was the worst. You need your feet. I swear to God, getting out of bed at 2:00 in the morning on a call out, and it felt like you were about to step on glass. And so then I'm like, all right, well, I'm going to go see a doctor. And I go see the doctor, and he goes, your blood pressure's out of whack. Your A1C is out of whack. Your hormone levels are all out of whack. He goes, so you're feeling like you're performing up here, and maybe you still are, but sooner or later that is going to crash if you don't do something immediately to start taking this into account. And they gave me 6 months to work without meds because I did not want to take meds. I'm not a big fan of popping pills and stuff. And that's when I really started looking into it. And that was when I finally made the decision to take a step back and heal up because the injuries had just piled up and now it was affecting my health.
The body keeps score.
It does, in fact, keep score.
We keep coming back to that. And it's funny you should mention plantar fasciitis because that might have been the first thing for me as well, which is kind of strange to hear somebody else say it. Yeah, it got so bad. I worked nights for a long time, like probably, I started in policing when I was 27, but quite frankly, I joined the military right out of high school. I worked in security police in the Air Force, and I worked shift work for almost all the 4 years. In college, I got out, I went to college. I bartended while I was in college. So I was in class during the day. I worked at night. So what did I give up? Sleep. Mm-hmm. And then I managed a restaurant for a couple of years before I started in policing. Same thing. I was working split shifts. I was working, 16 hours a day, from, usually like 8 or 9 in the morning till like 2 or 3 in the afternoon. You go home, you take a little break, then you come back, you work the evening rush, you're there again. And of course, when you're young, what do? You have a beer after work. And and then I started policing at age 27 and went right to midnight shifts. And I did that, outside of a couple of afternoon shifts where I worked like 4 to midnight, which still I was up. I don't think I slept during the day regularly until I was in my early 40s. And it was in my late 30s that plantar fasciitis kicked in. And if you've never had that, that's real. Like when you can't use your feet, nothing else matters.
That was horrible. I mean, I have a very high tolerance for pain. I have fought with a fractured eye orbital, a cracked jaw. I've had teeth knocked out of my mouth. I've broken my hands. But talk about that walking on glass feeling. And you're like, oh my God, how is this the worst? A broken rib doesn't feel this bad. And I'm like, how is it possible that my feet are going to be the cause of all of this misery? And there's probably a lot of affect that's part of that too. It's that whole idea that you realize you might be getting too old for this shit, that all of the shootings and stuff might be catching up to you, that there's been an extreme pull and you got to recover from it. All that's part of it too. But it was amazing to feel just that crippling sensation in the feet, or to be woken up from your sleep by those spasms. And you're like, what is happening to me? This shouldn't happen to an athlete, man.
Well, I will say this, and I don't necessarily recommend people do this because I haven't necessarily always been the smartest about stuff like this. I've kind of powered through things, but I was going to run a race. I was actually getting ready to run it was a Spartan Beast, and I had a flare up of the plantar fasciitis. So what did I do? Instead of resting and recovering, I went and got a cortisone shot in my foot. Now, and he explained to me why it hurts so bad is because of all the nerve bundles, and there's more nerve endings in your feet than for proprioception than pretty much anywhere else in the body. So he was like, they literally had 2 people come in and hold my leg down because they were worried about me kicking when I have, getting that needle in there. Yeah. So I got the shot and then went and ran the race. And, 2 weeks later, my foot was worse than it was before. So I've gotten smarter as I've gotten older, but let's use this as a good way, maybe a good segue to kind of go back now with all your experience. And, you just mentioned you've been in some police action shootings. You've been a fighter. You've got your own allostatic load that's building. So, from your own personal experience, if you were able to go backwards in time, okay, can I take what I know now, go back? How do I build the perfect version or the best version of Mike Malpass moving forward? What would I do differently?
The start with that understanding of how the brain processes information, that it isn't about seeking the highest highs and trying to avoid the lowest lows, that recovery is just as important as how well you perform, that each one of those pulls away from your baseline matters, and it matters a lot. And I would go back to that early version of me, and meditation I would have started a lot earlier, because peak performance is mindfulness. It really is. If you're looking for one word to define how you do extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances, it is mindfulness. It's being in the present moment, not reflecting on the mistakes of the past, not anxious about what's going to happen in the future. You're right here, you're right now. I would go back and do more of that work early on to avoid those pulls from the body budget, because even the mistakes I've made along the way have all been because of those pulls from the body budget. Personal things, not recovering, not understanding that it all connects together, that it isn't just on duty, then off duty. The two of them are connected. It isn't just awake and asleep. The two of them are connected. It's amazing when you start to, if I was a young man right now and I had this information, wow, it'd be amazing. The only thing maybe if I had all this information back then, maybe I would have never left the fight game, because I would have been able to take it to the next level, because the mental game is the highest game. And I caught on to the mental game a little bit too late for the fighting.
And so this concept is it's something that I don't know that we've done. If we've done it at all, we haven't done it well or not well enough. And that's take these this modern training methodology, this coaching model, and bringing it and applying it to at the beginning of our career. So, again, what we like to talk about is hire healthy, retire healthy, live a long, healthy life in retirement, but in that space in between, get maximum benefit from it. And, people sometimes hear like, oh, you're talking about like some of these foo-foo things like meditation and, worrying about all the, like the nutrition and, eating like a rabbit, whatever. What I like to try to get people to understand is that, it all matters. And just because you might spend some time meditating doesn't mean like that you're soft, that you don't have the right mentality. I mean, quite frankly, it's the opposite, right?
Yes.
And I would really encourage people to, to kind of cultivate that, not only in themselves, but, in the people that they're closest with, and to bring some of these concepts and ideas into the training, because that really is, I think, the future of how we're going to build the best police officers.
Absolutely. And think of it, we did it this way. Like, we do some pretty good stress training. Before I left, we were doing these chaos drills where we were getting people's heart rates up there pretty good. Give me more time, and what I would like to do is do the same chaos drills, get their heart rate way up, but in between, now we go to another room and I go, all right, now your job is to recover your physiology. So what I want you to do is 5 minutes of mindfulness work. And I want to monitor your heart rate. I want to monitor your blood pressure. I want you to see those things coming down. And I want you to learn this up and down, that we can modulate this, we can recover from this. And then I want cops to learn that, hey, you go to a call and you're a little bit anxious, you're a little bit, my God, how could you do that to a child? There's nothing wrong with calling your supervisor and going, I need 5 minutes, man. I need 5 minutes in a quiet place to recover. And if you can't give that to me, I'm going to take it anyway, because I'm responsible for the damn decisions I make. And I'm going to be very careful going forward here. This idea of the cops should be going call to call to call to call to call. No, they shouldn't. They should be recovering in between those calls, and they should have good tools for how to do it. And one of those tools is mindfulness. Another one is NSDR. Another one is binaural beats. I mean, there are ways where you can kind of recover your physiology a little bit, and then that just preps you for when you get home and you can get a decent night's sleep, instead of 15 calls in a row that ramped you all up, and then you get home and you can't sleep because you're still ramped up, you're anxious, and the body is still burning a tremendous amount of energy. We can do that where you go, not only are we teaching you how to take it up, we're also teaching you how to bring it back down again. And what you'll see is better decision making. If your whole goal is you want officers making better decisions, then you need a better cop who is a more healthy person. So even Affective Neuroscience says it. The best 3 predictors of brain performance are rest, diet, and exercise. The next thing after that, for whatever you do, is specific domain knowledge. So the more time you spend doing the different parts of your job and learning pattern recognition and how to make sound decisions. But that can only start from a good balance of rest, diet, and exercise. They're all connected. And if you have a skill or a skill set, but you don't train them under fear, anxiety, stress, and pressure, then when fear, anxiety, stress, and pressure ramp up, you can lose the skill or you can lose the skill set.
So you mentioned something a second ago I want to touch on, the scenario-based training, the chaos training where you're really ramping up the physiology. You're getting the heart rate up. You're getting people to feel the stress. The officers, have to make decisions while all that pressure, while that change in that physiology is occurring, and that some of the best ways to measure that now, because in the past it was kind of like, well, you just kind of had to adjust by feel, and we're not necessarily good at connecting with our feelings either, because we wear kind of that toughness as a badge of honor. And there are some technologies that are evolving. If you go back and listen to the episode where I talked to Dr. Catherine Plua, she's a digital health expert, and we had this conversation about heart rate variability, how to measure that. So like I've been wearing a Whoop strap for a while, and this was as a recommendation from a coach that I worked with. I used to wear a different device, but it didn't measure HRV. So it's been fascinating for me, towards the back end of my career, to see just how different stressors are impacting me, how it's carrying over from day to day. When I go to, when I wake up, I can see, am I in a state of recovery? Am I primed for, exertion or not? And I think that there's maybe a future for this in building this into training and awareness for our police officers.
Not maybe, it's vital that we do it.
Yes.
Because heart rate variability is one of the greatest measures and the simplest ones you can get. I mean, it's not hard. But it's one of the best investments you can make. And I don't know if that's, I'm not into the whole big problem solving for an agency. But if you wanted to make a great investment in your officers, that ability to track that data is enormous. And whether it's a tax refund that the officer takes in order to get it, it's vital information, man. It's one thing. I tend to overtrain. I tend to push myself till the wheels fall off. Then I get sick, or then something gets injured. As I get smarter now, I can learn through some of the mindfulness work. And I have not done a lot of the heart rate variability. I did some of the initial study work with it and played with it. I'm cheap in retirement, so once we start getting some money coming in here in retirement, I'll probably start investing back into the heart rate variability and measuring it all day long, as well as sleep quality, instead of doing it in spurts that I do now.
Yeah, and I think that I just bring it up because I just want people to think about this comprehensive approach. Like, all of these things matter. All the little things, yes, they make a big impact over the long run. And one of my big concerns right now is that we're looking for simple solutions to complex problems. And when you're looking at a retention and a recruitment issue where we're not getting enough people coming in, we can spend a lot of money and we can focus a lot of effort on trying to get more people into the profession. But if we have people inside the profession that are worn out, beat down, and it's only getting worse, we're accelerating that because of the pressure. Someone has to pick up the slack. The calls for service are still coming in. Then, maybe we make spends in the wrong places. And, the spend might be is, okay, well, let's make an investment in the process of determining which calls for service are the most important, what we're going to prepare for in a list of prioritization, so we can build now from the ground up. We can build this comprehensive training into an officer that's not just here's what policy says, here's what case law says, here's what best practices suggest that we do, but here's how we build you as a person to maximize your own potential. And by doing that, we're now investing in the person. That creates a better use of the technology and the equipment and the physical spends that you're going to make from a budgetary perspective on the officers themselves.
Absolutely. And it also requires a paradigm shift in the idea. What we do right now is 99% of the job anybody can do. And I'll be honest with you, I can train a chimpanzee to do 99% of a cop's job. In fact, I think we'd be better off with it. You get a chimp in a police uniform with a body camera, and I speak from a remote location through the microphone. Yes, sir, I understand you're angry, but Bonzo does not like it when you're angry. You're not going to like it if Bonzo gets angry. But 1% of the
That's
time,
so true.
1% of the time, it takes a special kind of asshole to deal with some of the stuff that we have to deal with. Hire for the 1%, the 99% will take care of itself. Hire and train for the 99%, and you're going to have some extreme difficulties in the 1% because the mispredictions that the brain can make under high fear, anxiety, stress, and pressure don't make sense to the average person watching on video, but they make sense to someone who's ever a prediction error. You ever been driving somewhere, a total non-cop one? You're driving somewhere, but your mind wanders, and you realize that a place you go to all the time, you just missed your exit, drove right by. You ever go to put a coffee cup down on the counter isn't there, the coffee cup crashes to the floor. These are prediction errors. Normally we make them every day and they don't cost us anything. But when a cop in a 1% situation or a perceived 1% situation makes a prediction error, it's going to be a costly one. That's what we don't seem to understand. And people don't seem to understand the difference between scaling. 1,000 people, just under 1,000 people die at the hands of the police every year. And that's kind of about that average, that 950 to 1,000. And I get it. You can want all you can want to, I'd love to make it zero, but it's never going to happen. But you can say, hey, we'd like to decrease the number of shootings. Great. What are you going to do for that? What is it you think you're going to do? Is it some idea, some broad idea? Well, what we need to do is de-escalate more. Well, great, but the other person has to want to be de-escalated. But look at us as a society. Somewhere between 79,000 and 250,000 people a year die due to medical errors. Where are the signs? Scalpel down. Don't do it. Where is it? Who's 250,000 people. Now, don't get me wrong. It's called practicing medicine for a reason. But where is the outcry? Where is the public going, oh my God, how are we going to decrease these numbers? It's like a free pass for this many medical errors. But here we go. Let's just wave the racism wand and say that 950 people died because cops are racist. It's a bias we all carry in our brain. We categorize, we divide into us and them. We love the us's, we hate the thems. But we do it. We have so many different categories for us. Your favorite sports team makes you an us. The guy wearing the other jersey makes them a them. What's the difference between the Boston Red Sox fans and the Yankees fans? Nothing, except what t-shirt they're wearing, and they hate each other for it. It's incredible what we can do when we create these little us-them categories. But when you understand body budget, prediction, you can now learn something going forward to do something about it, to realize that we need to make a bigger us group and not so many them groups. And it's not that hard to do. It just requires a little bit of work and a lot of education, really.
Well, so that's a great segue. We're already over an hour, getting closing in on an hour and a half. So let's touch on this and let's close this for a day, because we're going to come back and we're going to talk about some more specific ideas from your book, but on this concept of de-escalation, and this one, I think it's front and center. And I actually just recently wrote an article for LinkedIn where I kind of talked about this. De-escalation requires what and you touch on it. You say it better than anything in your book, like probably the best I've ever heard it explained, right? And you can teach a cop de-escalation, but what does that matter if what?
Yeah. If the other person doesn't want the scene de-escalated, the other person
right.
has a say in the matter. And sometimes they don't want to de-escalate. Drugs, psychotic episodes, mental health issues. Sometimes they don't want to de-escalate. De-escalation is a choice made by the person you are dealing with. De-escalation is not a tactic, but now we're playing word games, and it's kind of this sociology professor comes forward with a word game, and the word game is, if any force was used, the police failed to de-escalate this scene. And if no innocent person got hurt, if no other officers got hurt, then the scene was actually de-escalated. If nobody innocent got hurt, our number one priority is to innocent people. Unfortunately, you can't change this. If you start telling cops that your safety does not come next, then you're not going to have a lot of people who want to become police officers. And right now, there is kind of that impression out there when you talk to some of the young kids. They're like, I get the feeling like they would rather I get hurt as long as the suspect doesn't get hurt. And I'm like, well, I can't speak to that. I go, but I understand your feelings. I understand why you feel that way. I'm not saying it's true, but I understand why you feel that way. De-escalation is a choice. It is not a tactic. People love to throw that out. The police failed to de-escalate this. And now the new thing is you have some of these Department of Justice lawyers who are coming in and saying you cannot de-escalate by force. They want to change the term now so that they can say the police failed to de-escalate the scene. That is a word game, and it's dangerous. It's dangerous because it meets political objectives, but it doesn't go along with the science here, man.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to touch on, because now there are states that are creating laws that are setting up the policy is that you shall de-escalate, and it's based on a false premise that what you just explained is that the police are responsible for somebody else's behavior, and it will never work. And I've tried to, I talk about this at our state house, and I'm trying to get people to really understand this, but sometimes it's like, screaming into the void. Yeah. And that's another big takeaway that I want people to really think about. Like, you got to be really careful about some of these policies. They may sound good, and you may be able to stand at a podium and tell the 10%ers out there that are never going to like you anyway, that you can try to get them to like you and believe you, but they're just not, and they don't understand the complexities of those engagements. And it's I think any police administrator, and you personally have experienced this, in when you have a choice to make when it comes down to the use of force. It's always the force is always a result of non-compliance. I've just never seen it in my career. I've just never seen police use force where there was not a level of non-compliance to begin with. And it's a simple way of saying you can't force people to de-escalate. I don't know
Right.
how you can do it.
Right. What is the law except for coercion? Either you're going to obey the law, or someone like us is going to come and you're going to have to deal with them. But if your idea is when one of us comes and you've broken the law that we should just walk away, fine. Tell me which ones, though, because that's the new one, the new use of force policy that keeps coming out. And again, a lot of the DOJ recommendations, officers should learn that they should walk away from some situations. Okay, which ones? Because if you don't tell me, but you're mad about what happened in Uvalde, well, they technically, they did not engage. So which ones do you want them to engage in and which ones not? Because when you don't, you're doing what's called resulting. Poker players call it resulting. You're looking at the results and you're saying that you did everything right or wrong based on the results. And look at what we do as agencies. Officers do everything wrong, but get a lucky outcome. So we reward them with medals sometimes. And sometimes the officers do everything absolutely right, but the suspect makes a choice and it leads to lethal force confrontation. If you go back, you should look at the decisions and look at the process, not at the results. But we don't do it that way. And that is one of the major things. Well, even the media does it, and even most people watching it do it. But for all the people who are like, remember, it's two different parts of the brain working when you watch someone else do something and when you have to do it yourself. We all yell at the TV on Sundays, I could have caught that pass. I could have made that tackle. Really? Because just because you do it in the park against the Nerf doesn't mean you're going to do it against a player in the NFL. But it's so easy to throw it out there. But when you're involved in the play, when you have a 265-pound, extremely fast man about to hit you, sometimes there's a blip on the screen and you drop an easy catch. And you go, oh my God, I could have caught that. Yeah, if you didn't have a 265-pound bus about to run you over, maybe. Same thing with police use of force. It's so simple. When I watch John Wick, he does this, 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 and this. It's a movie with a script. It's just so easy because our brain, it's easy to do. Our brain does it all day long. It's a bias machine. And when we don't understand that, we come up with these policies. We have this one scenario we put the media through. We bring the media in, and they always ask kind of their catchy questions: unarmed people, unarmed people, unarmed people. I'm like, well, I'm going to tell you this right now. In 15 minutes, I'm going to put you through a couple of scenarios, and I guarantee you are going to shoot an unarmed man. I tell you in advance you're going to do it because I know you're going to forget as soon as you get in the heat of it.
Right.
Then I put you up against a guy who played in the NFL. He knows exactly how to intimidate, and he draws everyone, male and female, big and small, into shooting him. And then I immediately turn them around and go, "What did you just do?" He was so big, and he was so aggressive. Yeah, and what'd you do? I shot him. I go, "Oh, unarmed man shot. Isn't that the headline you're going to lead with?" And look on their face is incredible. It's this, like, yeah, now it happened to you, didn't it? Yeah. Now, don't get me wrong. We get more training, so we should be able to do it more. That's the other thing I hate when they show it on the TV. If someone does it, and you're like, okay, well, yeah, it is hard, but we should be training to make it better. If our officers can't do it any better, then we've got a problem with our training. So this is where we have to look at this and go, okay, now we understand the issue. How do we go about solving this problem? Because what we've done in the past isn't working for a lot of the officers.
And that the data on some of the studies that have been done have shown that the police have less bias than the general population because we are able to train it out of police officers. We're able to dose them and expose them to stressors. And so when you place them into, when you do compare them against the general population, they do far better. But you're never going to get the mainstream media, I think, in this environment to understand that. And, popular culture, it's kind of this interesting, dilemma that we're in, because we all love good movies. We all love entertaining shows, but these shows are what are setting us up for unrealistic expectations for when we actually do have to go perform. And then the very same people that create these shows and these environments are the same ones. They're going to be the first ones to criticize you when you don't do it right, which is that's sometimes that's a little bit tough to swallow. But again,
and we're guilty of it ourselves too. Think about it.
Yep.
The idea of training on the range is pretty much designed around Old West movies. Two guys would square off in the street, and then either the clock ticks or there's a countdown or someone makes the first move and you try to outdraw them. That's a complete fallacy. It happened during musket times when two guys who knew they weren't going to hit each other would show, look how manly I am. It's for honor. And they would launch a musket ball at each other. And every now and then they'd hit each other. In the Old West, they flat out murdered each other. They drank too much. Someone drew a gun and shot somebody else, or they shot and missed, and then someone shot and killed them. It's no different than it is today. So what do? The time to get that gun in your hand and fire the first shot is the most important. And we've been training it that way for years. No, the time to make the first accurate decision is the most important time. The time from surprise to recovery from surprise is the most important time. Because I've seen plenty of people who have a sub 1 second draw and shoot completely fail in a real shooting. So I know that they're disconnected. But I've also seen people who can do it in both. So there is a disconnection, and then there is something to it. And what is to it is being able to manage the fear, anxiety, stress, and pressure. The people who can do that better and have a skill set have an integration of skill sets. They can make the skill sets work together. The people who can't, they disassociate. And that's how some of our worst behaviors happen, even though it is a very small percentage of the time. But if we make a healthier, stronger officer, 99% of the time, we're going to make a better officer 1% of the time if our training is good. And if we make a better officer 1% of the time, the 99% is going to take care of itself. That's the gist of what we're missing right now.
All right. Well, that's a perfect place to wrap it up for today. I've got several notes for things that we're going to hit on if you'll honor me to come back.
I'd love to.
All right. So in closing, I think what I'm hearing there for our police leaders out there and our police officers is we need to build better predictive machines in addition to being good shooters. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, it's not the first shot that wins, right? It's the first shot on target that wins after you've made the right decision to pull the trigger. So sometimes you got to go backwards to go forward. And how can people learn more about your work, Mike, and where can they find you if they're interested in discussing some of these concepts in greater detail?
Well, the two books are easy to find. They're on the internet now. They're Amazon, Barnes and Noble. They're all over the place now. So you can find the two books. Combative Resolutions is my website. If you just run my name, you'll get the website also. And then with the website, there's the link tree for some of the seminars we have coming up. We have a seminar coming up in Chandler in March. If you're interested in your local, or you want to come to Arizona in March, where it's getting the temperature's getting really nice.
Nice.
Come on in. There's information on how to get seats for that, and then we'll try to keep updating that. And then the goal is to get on the road and start teaching more, and then see if we can maybe get a study going to a small agency that's looking to try out some of the things, and we put a research study together and prove that we can build a better one, as opposed to just these are our ideas and we hope it works.
Well, that's awesome, and I really appreciate your work in that area, because that really is the future, right? We've got to be willing to take chances and do things. It's okay to fail, but I like to say is fail falling on your face, not on your. So let's fail forward and keep building better. Great. Thank you for being here today. Thanks for spending some of your valuable time with us. And until our next opportunity we get to speak, I'll be 10:42. Thank you, sir.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.